Yeah, the first one was a bit of a disaster. Yeah, this one is. I don't know why the other one wasn't working, to be honest. Is it not working on your laptop? It's being weird and annoying this time. Anyway. Yeah, doesn't matter. What do you want to start with? Poetry or an Inspector Calls? It's only you right now, yeah. There may be others joining. But think of it as a one-to-one lesson. So, Inspector Calls or poetry first? Because everybody wanted poetry initially, but I wasn't sure. Yeah, we can do poetry. Do you want to do form and structure, poetic devices, or context? Context first. All right. So it would depend on which poems you wanted to do. Most people tend to be comfortable with the first 5 and not the other 10. So we could start at the back and then move forwards, or go from the front and then move backwards. Go get water, it's fine. But yeah, so apparently we're going to be doing poetry. And we're going to start with devices, I think. Might be the best thing to start with. All right, so should we start with checking out me history? So it's the last poem that you're going to be doing in the anthology, and it's a good thing to know a bit about John Agard. All right, so what do you actually know about him? He's mostly, the main thing you need to know is he's Caribbean. He's Caribbean and came to the UK when he was still quite young in 1977. But the main thing is the fact that the poem is about him not being taught Caribbean history. Wait, what? Checking out my history is not the last in your anthology. Are you sure? You sure Kamikaze is the last one? You sure Kamikaze isn't before checking out my history? It's not. Check the last one in your for Power and Conflict. Last poem is John Agard's Checking Out My History. And you can look at it right now. The last one is Checking Out My History. Kamikaze is before it. It's the penultimate one. To be honest, even if it was the last one, we're still going to get to it. But since I want to start at the back and I don't want to start at the second to last poem, I want to start there. You can send a snap. It's still not going to change the fact that Checking Out My History is the last one. But as I was saying, John Agard, Caribbean, from Guyana. For some rather inexplicable reason, her anthology actually does have Kamikaze as the last poem. But since we're going to do both, it doesn't really matter. So the last one I have in this is Checking Out My History. So for the revision guide, the last one is this, and Kamikaze is the second to last one. And with the other anthologies that I've seen, Checking Out My History is the last one. But no, we're arguing about weirdness, to be honest. So yeah, so John Agard, Caribbean, from Guyana, came to the UK in 1977, which means he grew up here. Obviously, if you guys have done history here, you know that the history we learn tends to be European, occasionally American. Sometimes we might learn about apartheid, the world wars, and that sort of thing. But you don't ever learn about Caribbean history or Black history. Or if they do Black history, they tend to only ever look at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. They don't look at the smaller characters in history. So what the poet is trying to say is that what he learned in school isn't the full history. It's a whitewashed version. So what you need to remember is he's trying to make a political statement with his poem. So that is the context you need to know. So regardless of whatever question they ask you, the context is he is making a political statement in that what is taught in schools is a whitewashed version of history. For form and structure on that one, it doesn't really have a specific form. it's supposed to be written in the style of a bit of a song, kind of, but it's mostly he does shorter bits for when he's talking about the Caribbean people. I don't know if he lived in London, but to be honest, it doesn't really. It doesn't matter. Just as long as you know that he moved to Britain in 1977 when he was quite young. I think. Wait, yeah. So when he was quite young, so he went to school here. He was here for primary school. Was here for secondary school. He did all his education here, which is why he tends to talk about it like that. But for form and structure, there is no standard form. He doesn't actually follow any of the normal forms. So it's not a sonnet, it's not a villanelle, it's not a ballad, it's not an ode, it's none of the ones you know about. It's a mixture, so it's a bit broken. It's a way of him rebelling. Is he still alive? I think so. I think he's still alive, yes. Because the poem was published in the early 2000s, so I think he's still alive. Yeah, I think he's still alive, but to be honest, it's not really relevant whether he is alive or not. I forgot where I was now. Yeah, form. It's a mix of stanzas, so it's him rebelling. And what I mean by rebelling is obviously in school you're taught that things have to be written in a certain way. And if they're written in a certain way, then that makes it correct. So by him writing with a mixture of different forms and different stanzas, he's going against everything he was taught in school, which is again him talking about how what he was taught in school is the whitewashed version of history. So a lot of the characters in the poem is a mixture. So some of them are real and some of them are fake. So there's real characters I mentioned, real people from history and fake people from history. Obviously, Napoleon was real. Toussaint was real. And Nanny de Maroon was not. She was more of I think she was a legend. That's part of a story. So it's a weird mix. So like I said, Nanny de Maroon, she's from a story, so she's a fictional character. That's what I mean by fake people. But there's obviously real characters in history that he mentions, like Napoleon and Toussaint. They're both actual members of history. But we know who Napoleon is because we've learnt European history. But people don't know who Toussaint was. They don't really mention Caribbean history. That's what I mean by fake people. Not really much more you need to know about. There are obviously going to be poetic devices within this, but the devices are there to help you remember things. So like I said, there's bits of it that sound a bit like a song. So it's supposed to flow a bit better. Plus, it's supposed to go with the whole Caribbean patois. So the way people speak in the Caribbean is supposed to go like that. It's supposed to flow a bit better. But it's a bit hard to always. Oral tradition. A lot of countries didn't obviously. Well, obviously you're there too, so I don't know why you're complaining, to be honest. So oral history, a lot of people didn't write down their histories. So writing history down was more of a European. So oral history is they would tell the stories of what was happening through stories. And then when things are done in a story, that's what it means by oral tradition. So you're passing the stories down verbally. So your grandfather told you, who then told your father, who then told you. Yeah, more than welcome to go and watch Mr. Bruff. That was unnecessary. That was unnecessary, to be honest. But yeah, so oral tradition is in they would tell things they would tell things through a story. That's what it was. That's what it means by oral tradition. Rather than it being written down. Any others questions? Well, he starts the poem with a dialect because it's his way of reconnecting with his Caribbean roots. He could have started the poem any way he wanted to, but he chose dialect because it's his way of showing that he is Caribbean, no matter where he grew up, where he went to school, what he was taught, he is Caribbean. So he chose to write with dialect to show that. Everything they do is always for a reason. Yeah, so kamikaze? All right, the thing you need to remember about kamikaze is it's different in its context. Everyone assumes that the writer of kamikaze is Asian. However, it's not. It's a white poet who works for the NHS as a researcher. But it's interesting that she chose to write her poem on kamikazes. So, in case you don't know what a kamikaze is, they were suicide pilots from Japan during the Second World War. So they were told to literally get in their planes, shoot the people below them, and once they were out of bullets, to crash their plane into whatever target they could find. Or to compare, checking out my history, it would depend on what the question is. If it was for identity, I would say Mother Any Distance or The Emigre. But checking out history doesn't actually have a lot of themes it falls into. I think one of the themes it does fall into is the power of humans. So then to compare with that one would be Ozymandias, London, My Last Duchess. What else? Possibly War Photographer as well. Yeah, I can do that. But it would depend on what themes we're looking at. So obviously, as they all have different themes, it's hard to decide which ones to compare it to. So for kamikaze, like I said, kamikaze is about, it's written interestingly because it's being told by the daughter about what the father did. it kind of doesn't. Yes and no. It does look at identity because, like I said, it's from the daughter's perspective about the father. So it can look like, so it can be looked at in that sense. So it can be in you looking at the identity of the father, the fact that he gets shunned by everyone for not doing what he was supposed to do, and the fact that it was his job as a pilot to do the kamikaze. So to an extent, yeah, you can compare it to checking out my history, but only in the sense of identity. I don't think you can compare it in any other way. So it may not be the best one to have. Yeah, it may not be the best one. It can be done. It would depend on the question, to be honest. You don't know what's going to come up. Ooh. I don't think any of them really use regular sestet. I don't think any of them. Yes, power and conflict. But I think kamikaze is the only one that uses regular sestet. There is obviously sonnet. There's obviously the sonnet in Ozymandias that has a sestet, but none of them actually use it regularly. But to be honest, you would never be comparing poems based on the forms they use. You'd always be looking at the theme. So once you are familiar with the different themes, you'll be able to know which ones to compare and which ones to add together and group together. But yeah, so form and structure for kamikaze, third person narrative in reported speech of the daughter. The first three stanzas, first five stanzas are a single sentence. So it's kind of like a stream of consciousness. It's them trying to get everything out, and they don't actually use punctuation until later on to end it. And then the last two stanzas are kind of a solution. So it's the end, kind of what happens to him after he doesn't complete his mission. But like I said, because it's third person narrative, it does create a distance between the narrator and the character it's discussing. So when he does get shunned, it's not as traumatic as it should be. But yeah. Third person narrative, reported speech. First five stanzas are a single sentence, and the last two stanzas are just looking at the consequences of his actions. What poems I think will come up tomorrow? For some odd reason, I have a feeling it's going to be in the last five. So anything from war photographer onwards, I think is going to come up. Although, to be honest, I tell everyone, since nobody knows, it's best for you to be familiar with everything. You don't know, they could actually just randomly give you Ozymandias again. But I've noticed people tend to not look at the last five poems, especially Tissue. People do not like Tissue. I don't know why people don't like Tissue. It's not a bad poem, to be honest. But yeah. I think people hate it because it's too metaphorical. It's not literal. So that's why people tend to have an issue with it. But I don't mind it. It's an okay poem. Do you have any more questions for Kamikaze, or should we move on to the Emigre? You want to go over tissue next? We've got the emigre in between. You don't want to do the emigre. Fair enough. All right, tissue, context-wise, the I know what you're trying to say. It's okay. So context-wise for tissue, Imtiaz Dhaka was Pakistani and grew up in Glasgow, but now she kind of lives in between Britain and India. So she moves between the two. So she went from Pakistan to Scotland to India and in between. So, like I said, tissue is a very metaphorical poem. It does not mean tissue literally. She's looking at the fragility of the paper and how it can represent humans and people and how we're fragile and the way something can be torn apart. Everybody hates tissue, apparently. Right, so the first 3 stanzas are looking at the importance of paper because we use paper to record a lot of things. So history is being recorded on paper. What we do in life gets recorded on paper. So that's what it's looking at. It's looking at the way it's used in that sense. Then it kind of focuses on how fragile it is. Like I said, looking at the fragility of paper. It's a metaphor. So looking at the fragility of it and how it compares to humans and us and people. But it's still, what's my predicted for English literature? I'm not a student, I'm a teacher. I teach English. I don't study it. I'm older than I look. Don't worry about it. I get this a lot. I think I'm actually about twice your age. So the fragility of tissue in comparison to people. Twice. Yes, I'm 30. Shh. So the way it controls our lives, we use paper a lot in what? Well, darling, I was trying to be nice. No need to throw my age in my face again. Yeah, we can do Storm on the Island next. But yeah, so tissue, it's a metaphor looking at the fragility of humans and paper and how we use it to record history, but it's still such a fragile thing and it can just disappear and we don't know where it's going to go. Form and structure for tissue. It doesn't have a very specific poetic voice, so you can't say whether it's first person or third person. The narrative of it is pretty elusive. But again, if you point out anything to do with the form and structure, you're still going to get the marks for it. Short stanzas, most of them in 4 lines, except for the very last line. So I think there's 9 stanzas total with a single line at the end. It does use enjambment and caesura quite a bit, so make sure you point that out. 3 main, like I said, 3 main parts. It moves through it. So using paper to record history, the fragility of it, and how it can be used to create things in life. So if you know that, you should be okay. Yeah. Yeah. So if you're comfortable with the form and structure and the fact that it's going through stages, then you should be okay. Pointing out the devices, please. Don't forget the devices. I beg you. It's weird how you can get marks from simple things like mentioning enjambment and mentioning caesura. You don't always have to know why it's used, but if you can point it out and the effect of it, then you'll get the marks. Should we do, you said you wanted to do Storm on the Island next. Everyone okay with that? Oh, so fun fact about Seamus Heaney, he actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995. It was for a collection of poems as well. So it's very rare to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in poetry. You tend to get it mostly for novels, but he did it for his collection of poems. But yeah, so Storm on the Island is actually about a community who are getting ready for a storm, and it's discussing the way they're preparing themselves, so the things they're getting ready, and then it looks at how they are affected by the storm, which in this sense is not very positively. So there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of angst and anxiousness. The poem itself is in a single stanza. It doesn't actually have any other breaks within it. So it's all, because it's all together, it kind of shows how everything happened very quickly. So they went from being very confident to being very afraid by the end of the poem. It's written in blank verse, so it's supposed to mirror the way people talk in their day-to-day life. So it's supposed to mirror everyday speech. It does use first-person plural. You will need to know quotes for all the poems, yeah, because they're only going to give you one. So you need to have at least a few quotes for each theme that poems cover. So if one poem has 3 themes, I would say make sure you have about 9 to 12 quotes. To be honest, you don't even need that many because some of them overlap. A lot of the quotes will overlap. But you do need to know a few quotes for each one. Sneaky thing I tell people to do is find out which poems cover the most number of themes and memorize those. Yeah, 4-poem method, you can do that. So I'd say there's about 5 or 6 poems that you can cover that will basically cover all of the themes, which is not a bad way to do it. So it's better for you to learn 5 poems than it is to learn 15. Poems that cover the most themes: War Photographer, Kamikaze, and Poppies. They both cover 6 themes each. Yeah, so War Photographer, Poppies, and Kamikaze, they cover the most. So they tend to look at identity, power of nature, power of conflict, individual experiences, memory, loss. So it covers, those 3 are the ones that cover the most. And then the other 2 I would also suggest would probably be Remains and Prelude. Yeah, War Photographer, Kamikaze, Poppies, they cover the most. And then Prelude and Remains also cover a nice chunk. Although it doesn't hurt to know My Last Duchess, because that one tends to look at a lot of things. So if you're going to be realistic, since it is almost 8 o'clock the night before. Oh, my favourite has to be London. I love London. Blake has always been a favourite poet of mine. I am not aiming for a grade. I have already done my GCSEs. I did them 14 years ago. No, not just you. It happens. I am what they like to call black don't crack. Love and relationships. Am I fasting? Not today. But that's a bit of a personal question to ask. Other than abuse of power, so yeah, so it shows power of humans, and I think I'd say pride. Pride is the other thing. Yeah, not gonna lie. Doing exams while you're fasting is probably gonna be horrendous. I only have to teach and not get angry at kids. What do you mean by is it not imagination? Yeah, so what do you mean by not imagination? For My Last Duchess, uh, to be honest, for the unknown poetry, you don't. Personally, I don't think you should stress about it. So yeah, so for the unknown poetry, oh, nice teeth, thank you. Yeah, for the unknown poetry, as long as you know the different poetic forms and the different poetic devices, you should be okay, because you are going to be given one question which is worth 24 marks and one question which is worth 8. That's the comparison one. But the first one is going to be getting you to look at the way language is used. So if you're familiar with the different poetic devices and why each one is used, then you should be okay. So I wouldn't stress that one as much as the others because they're giving it to you. Oh yeah, My Last Duchess, she's not his imagination. She's actually his first wife. So My Last Duchess was based on the real Duke of Ferrara from Italy. And rumor has it that he had his first wife killed because he thought she was flirting with other men when she should have been loyal to him. So the portrait he's showing is of his first wife, and he's showing it to the man who's supposed to help him marry his second wife, which is a bit of a weird thing to do. Like the guy's trying to set you up and find you a new wife, but you're showing him the picture of the portrait of your first wife, who everyone thinks you had killed. Yes, poetic forms, as in, is it a sonnet? Is it a blank verse? Is it free verse? Is it an ode? Is it a ballad? Is it a villanelle? So knowing the different poetic forms is gonna, knowing the different poetic forms is gonna help. What do you mean you haven't even revised yet? Like, wait, is literature in the morning or the afternoon? Oh, so yeah, so you guys should get a decent amount of revision now, get to bed early, and then just refresh. Listen, you need to get well in all your GCSEs, as many as possible. You never know, you may not do as well in one of the other ones like sociology or history, and then literature is the one that's going to save you, because you do need a certain number of GCSEs to go to sixth form or to go to university. Language and maths may be the ones they want, but you're still going to need as many as possible, especially if you're looking to go to a grammar school. Did I not spell it right? I'm terrible at spelling, to be honest, weirdly. Oh, you did not spell it right. I thought I misspelled it. But yeah, so poetic forms, knowing the different ones is good. So a sonnet, 14 lines, iambic pentameter. Free verse, no specific rhyme or reason. You better get a 9. Where was that one? I keep getting distracted. Aww. No one's target is a 2. Like, if your school gives you a target of a 2, then they're failing you. It's terrible. Oh, we know you're not laughing at her. I think you're laughing at my weirdness. But yeah, so if you cover those 6, you should be okay. So Kamikaze, War Photographer, Poppies, Remains, Prelude. Oh yeah, 5. I just like throwing in my Last Duchess because it's just one of my favorites. Don't. London's a nice, easy poem, but it doesn't cover a lot of themes. So if you revise London, you may not be able to use it as much as you want to. Kamikaze, yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So go for the ones that will actually help you more. I know they're not as fun and they're not as easy to remember, but London doesn't cover a lot of themes. Yeah, Kamikaze, War Photographer, Poppies, Remains, and Prelude. I could tell you to revise all 15, but I'd rather be honest and say just go for the ones that are going to actually help you because they can be compared to a lot of things. Remains looks at, so it looks at a lot of conflict, memory, guilt, and individual experience. So for conflict, you can use it to compare to Bayonet Charge, Charge of the Light Brigade, War Photographer. For individual experiences, you can use it to compare to Tissue, Checking Out Me History, again, Bayonet Charge, and the Emigree. How to revise last minute. Context, form, structure, and themes. If you know the context, so when it was written or when it was set, know the form and structure, so the way it's written. So is it written in a specific sonnet? Is it written in a villanelle? Is it written in ballad? And then how it's organized. And the themes, so knowing what it fits into will help you remember the quotes a bit better. And like I said, you only need a few. Top 4 poems: War Photographer, Poppies, Remains, and Kamikaze. Those would be the top 4. Although Prelude is still good. Make it 5. Don't do 4. Make it 5. Just to balance out so you can cover all of the themes. I feel bad. I think somebody asked me about love and relationships earlier, but I don't think a lot of people are doing that. Yes, we'll do love and relationships. Okay. You're going to hate me when I tell you that the poem that covers the most themes is Before You Were Mine by Carol Ann Duffy. It covers 7 different themes. Because love and relationship has a lot more themes than power and conflict. So when you were before you were mine covers a lot. Let me see. Follower. Neutral tones. And Sonnet 29. So those would be the ones I'd recommend for love and relationship. Sonnet 29, neutral tones, follower, before you are mine. Those ones will cover everything for you for love and relationships. Predictions for an inspector calls. I'm leaning towards Gerald or Mr. Berlin, but then again, I'd say revise everything. Predictions for Blood Brothers, I cannot tell you. Every school I've ever taught at has only ever done an inspector call, so I've never done Blood Brothers. Although I have read that play, it's actually quite interesting. Sorry. The schools in the southeast tend to teach easy stuff, and inspector calls is very easy. Wolf photographer, kamikaze, remains, poppies, and prelude. Yes, those 5. They will cover every theme. Yeah, inspector calls is actually pretty good. The thing I always tell everyone for inspector calls is make sure you're comfortable with the context. So obviously, because it's written in 1945 but set in 1912, there's a lot of things that happen in those years. So make sure you know about First World War, Second World War, Wall Street crash, votes for women. What was the other one? The Third Reich coming into power, and and the Russian Revolution of 1917, because a lot of stuff that happened in that is used for the dramatic irony when they make Mr. Berlin look like he has no idea what he's talking about. So make sure you're comfortable with the context. I tend to hide anything with swear words in it. So if you wrote something that has a naughty word in it, you may want to go into your glossary, your mind glossary, and find another way of describing that person, even though it's a fictional character. Despite the fact I may agree. But we have to remember Sheila is portrayed in that way for a reason. She was made to fall into the stereotypes of how a young lady should behave. They were expected to be rude and pretentious and spoilt. So she was doing what she was supposed to do. So she was portrayed the correct way. And that is why she has her redemption at the end. Because you're not going to see her change if she started off being nice at the beginning. Gerald being innocent. It's not a misconception. The consensus is we still have no idea if Eva Smith and Daisy Renton are actually the same person. We do know Gerald had an affair with a girl called Daisy Renton. We do know that the Berlins had different interactions with a girl named Eva Smith. But there is no concrete proof that they are one and the same. So he was guilty of his affair, but he may not have contributed to Eva's suicide. So it's not a misconception, it's more of a we don't actually know. In the actual text, he has a relationship with Eva. I think the movie shows him raping her, but in the actual text, he does have a relationship with her, which is where the pregnancy comes from, and he does steal money for her from his dad's company, which she rejects. But again, like I said, it doesn't specifically say in the text that he rapes her. It was from the movie, so it's the director's adaptation. Any movie you've ever watched of anything, you've got to remember, when a director's doing it, it's their adaptation. No matter what Priestley wrote in his stage directions, the director can change it. They can make changes to it to suit what they're trying to portray. So I think in the movie he's shown as raping her, but I don't actually think he does. All right, so the thing I always tell for introductions, make sure you reword the question so that whoever's reading it knows what you're talking about, just in case they don't have the question, and then put in relevant context. So if they're asking you about Sheila, put in the context of how she was expected to behave by society standards. If the question's about Eric, again, same thing, how he was expected to behave by society standards. He was supposed to be out there and partying and being young and free and wild. Same for Gerald, same for Edna. She came up a couple years ago, so I don't know if they're going to bring her up again. But for any characters, make sure you put in relevant context. If it's about one of the themes, so make sure you know about historical stuff, like I was saying, for anything like between 1912, from the Titanic sinking to the end of the Second World War, all the different things that happened. And then the best way to structure is when you do a plan. Do a plan. I know you hate them and people don't like plans, but write down all your ideas, get them, just jot them down. You don't have to use them all, but jot them down, plan it out that way. And for each point, do it in its own paragraph. Some of them will be long and some of them will be short. But when it's structured so they're individual paragraphs, it's easier for the examiner to see your points and more likely to be able to say, okay, they have a valid point and give you marks. If it's all scrunched up together, ain't nobody like that. Nobody likes to read that. Nobody likes to see that. It's hard to read. And I'd rather you not lose marks on something that you could easily organize. Try to make it so it goes in chronological order. So if it's a theme question about, say, dramatic irony, then make sure all the dramatic irony things you mention are in order. So if it's starting from Titanic, then you move on to the First World War, then you move on to the Russian Revolution, Wall Street crash, Second World War, that way. So if it flows chronologically, it's going to make more sense. And for your conclusion, don't put in any new quotes, don't put in any new points. You're supposed to summarize the things you've said, add your opinion, and answer the question. Because the whole point of you doing it is to answer the question. It doesn't have to be long. Most conclusions tend to be 2 or 3 sentences, so that's like maybe 3 to 5 lines. But it's you rounding off and letting them know that you're done. Plan. How many paragraphs should I aim to write for an Inspector Calls? Minimum 4 points. So at least 4 paragraphs, not including your introduction and conclusion. You'd need at least, to make it a good solid essay, I would say a minimum of 4 points with your introduction and your conclusion as well. So that's 6 in total. You don't know, you never know, you may end up doing a lot more points. So don't worry about how many paragraphs. I never like it when people ask me that. I'd rather you jot down your ideas. If you end up only jotting down 3 ideas, make sure for an Inspector Calls, are you doing Edexcel or AQA? Because I know for AQA, you're not given an extract for an Inspector Calls. Yeah, so if you're doing AQA, there's no extracts when in spectacles. You'll be given an option of 2 questions. It happens. People forget what they're doing. So yeah, so you'll be given an option of 2 questions. So all of it will be from wherever you find in a text. So how familiar are you with the text? But yeah, so best thing for inspector calls, you need to remember the order in which the inspector exposes everybody. So he exposes Mr. Berlin first, then Sheila, then Sybil, then Gerald. No, sorry, Gerald, then Sybil. My apologies, and then Eric last. So it happens in Act 1. It's Mr. Berlin and Sheila. Act 2 is Gerald and Sybil. So Mrs. Berlin, in case you forgot her name. And Act 3 is Eric. So there's only 3 acts in the play. No scenes, just the 3 acts. But once you know what happens when, it makes it easier for you to find the quotes that you need to find. But yeah, so one of the questions will be on character, one of the questions will be on theme, and you choose the one that you are. I think I'm going to show my age now and say I have no idea what you just said. I don't know if that's a typo or if I'm just super old right now. Yeah, don't answer both character and theme. Pick one and only answer one. I am not super old. I am older. It's just that ER at the end. Older. Ah, then why not just say that? I don't understand why. Yes, it is an adverb. It's a way of describing the action of aging. I'm very well, thank you. How are you? Yeah, so any other questions on Inspector Calls or poetry? Because right now, techniques for poetry. For your introduction, make sure you put in, like I said, so reword the question and put in context for the poems. So make sure you know a little bit about it. So if it's about London, then mentioning William Blake was an advocate for education and was against people having a lot of power just because they had money or whatever. So then you put the context in at the beginning. And in the second paragraph you do after your introduction, do the form and structure, because you get quite a lot of marks for form and structure. And if you put it in early on, you don't have to worry about those marks. It's such an easy way of losing marks. So put that in form and structure. Whatever you notice, if you can't remember the proper name for things, that's fine. If you say it has 15 lines, every other line rhymes and it's broken up into 2 stanzas, then that's fine. You're still discussing the form and structure. It's better if you know that it's written in blank verse or free verse or dramatic monologue. But if you can't remember it, it's not the end of the world. It's better for you to just point it out. Unseen poetry. Can you reference the quote? I don't know what you mean by reference the quote. If you're making a point, you're obviously going to need your evidence, so you quote from the text or from the poem. I don't know what you mean by reference it. But for unseen poetry, like I said, it's 2 sections. So they've got section 1 and section 2. Paraphrase. If you cannot remember it, then you paraphrase it, but it's better if you quote, because then you get the marks for the evidence. Even if you misquote it and it's still in quotation marks, it's better than you not quoting it at all. Like if you make a word mistake here or there, it's not going to be the end of the world. It's better for you to quote it than to paraphrase. Unseen poetry, like I said, it's 2 sections. So section 1 is they give you a poem, and that question's worth 24 marks. And they're going to ask you to answer a question on a specific theme. That one, you're just going to be answering that theme question, mention the form, mention the structure, mention the poetic devices. And that one's worth 24 marks. The second part of it is when they tell you to compare it to a second poem, and that one is only worth 8 marks. So the comparison part is only worth 8 marks. It's the one where you're analyzing one single poem that you're going to get the majority of your marks on. So annotate that poem like your life depends on it. Because whatever you put down the first 5 minutes, you may not use it all, but at least it's fresh in your mind and you won't get stuck later on. Do you think Gerald has changed? I don't think Gerald is supposed to change. Gerald is one of them characters, is the main character that's supposed to be the in-between. He was supposed to be the catalytic one, in that if he changed the way he was, then they were successful, because if he would have been able to persuade Mr. and Mrs. Berlin that what they were doing was wrong. But he chose to acknowledge he did something wrong, but chose to say, it's what expected, I'm going to keep going with the way things are expected, instead of deciding, okay, no, things are different, let's do a whole new thing. So he didn't change because he's not supposed to change. Techniques for structure. For poetry again. Or structuring for an inspector calls. Okay, so for poetry, like I said, reword the question and put in relevant context. So, all right, let's do an example question of, we're looking at the power of humans, and the poem that you've been given is London. So I would say William Blake uses his poem London to express how humans take advantage of others when they have power. Blake was a staunch activist who wanted to change the way the church and people in power controlled everything. Another poem that also looks at the power of humans is My Last Duchess, in which Browning explores the power a husband has over his wife. So you putting in a bit of rewording the question, putting in a bit of context about the poet, and making sure that they know what you're answering, as if they don't have the question. Then once you've done the introduction, the second paragraph you do should be on the form and structure. So mentioning that London is written in 4 stanzas of 4 lines each, with an alternating A-B rhyme scheme. And mentioning that My Last Duchess is done in the form of a dramatic monologue, in which it's from the perspective of the speaker only. Does the quote of an inspector call saying, "I don't play golf," show how he does not like individual competitive games, as they show capitalism, and that Priestley, who is a socialist, wants to show that we should be? I think it's pretty close, to be honest, because golf is played only by people of wealth. So him saying, "I don't play golf," is him stating where he is socially, and that he believes he is below the Berlins, not in a bad way, but he believes that he doesn't play golf because it was such an expensive game to play back then. Still is actually now even. So it's mostly something that's done by the more wealthier people. So it does, yeah, so it does show, I'm not sure about the individual competitiveness, but it does show about capitalism and that, yes, Priestley was definitely a socialist and he would not have approved of the game of golf. Can you say that Inspector Calls is cliche? Not at the time it was written, no. For us now, we would consider it cliche. It's him trying to change the world with his ideas of being socialist and being socially responsible. We have to remember at the time, that was the first year Labour came into power. People had just come out of a war. Everyone was rather traumatized by a lot of things. A lot of people died. So it wasn't cliche at the time. It was actually rather revolutionary. In fact, it was too revolutionary, which is why it was first shown in Russia, which is a socialist country, before it was originally shown in London in 1946, a year after it was published. Yes, Dog Eats Taco is very clever. I agree. What's the best way to revise the themes for an Inspector Calls? To be honest, Inspector Calls doesn't have a lot of themes. You have more. There are more characters than themes for an Inspector Calls, I would say. But I've noticed if you combine the two, if you're doing quotes for themes, once you've written the quotes, if you write down the character, then you've kind of doubled up on it as well. So you know who said it, and you've got the character and theme quotes at the same time. Revise the poems. Find the poems that have the most themes and revise those, because it's the night before. I'm realistic. As much as I was optimistic in September, I'm realistic now. So if you're doing power and conflict, we've already said it's war photographer, kamikaze, poppies, remains, and prelude. And if you're doing love and relationship, then you should be doing Before You Are Mine, Sonnet 29, Follower, and Neutral Tones. Did you hear about a new Fortnite update? I do not play Fortnite. I have never played Fortnite. I have nothing against Fortnite. It's just I've never played it. Is Eric similar to Gerald? Eric is supposed to be similar to Gerald. So Gerald is the ideal for what a young gentleman is supposed to be. So he's supposed to be a young man about town, partying and drinking with his friends and doing what he's supposed to be doing as a man of wealth. Eric is supposed to be following what Gerald does, although he tends to drink more. And that's what led to a lot of his problems. No, Eric can, even though they're similar, like I said, Eric's supposed to be what Gerald is. Eric and Sheila, they both have that bit where they are redeemed in the end. So they actually have a redemption at the end of it all. So they change. So they're no longer the ones who believe what they're doing is correct. Gerald doesn't have that redemption. So he would come up in that he's supposed to be, he could come up in that he's supposed to show that even though he is closer to the age of the younger generation who see the wrongs they're doing, he stays with the mentality of the older generation and doesn't believe that the things he did was wrong. Okay, it's time for me to go downstairs and make some food, iftar, because I need to eat. Hopefully I answered some questions and helped you. If you do still want to, there are videos. No, you may not. You may not have that pass. There are videos, so I did do a summary of all the poems, looking at the context, a summary of the poem, form and structure. There are no quotes. I don't do quotes for people because you're more likely to remember your own ones. There is also a summary of the themes video up there, and there is also one for an inspector calls. So have a look through the videos, watch the ones you need to watch. Don't watch them if you don't want to. It's not the end of the world for me. But hopefully it helped. And I will be doing a couple more for language because that is the one that we have to pass. Language is the one that I will not let anybody fail. You're very welcome. I'm glad I could help. Toodles.